Hi, this is a video about my latest thoughts regarding the isolationism and how it fits in with the public's view of it. Why might people not want to question the legitimizing of the shutdowns, self-isolationism, either as a short or as a longer term measure? It seems like it's a very popular idea. Certainly the few that I've met so far seem to agree with the measures, most, and likewise most contacts online that I've encountered, though I admit these might not be a representative sample, so it's hard really to know what any majority might think. As the Zen quote says, when the masses are reduced to one, what then is one reduced to? That is to say, how can we speak for majority? How can we know how they're feeling, what their thoughts are, what their concerns are? It's really hard for even me to know exactly how I feel about things, with such a complicated situation changing so fast, without knowing how vast numbers know what what vast numbers of people think about things. And so we must be cautious before assuming that we can know what so many different people think. Whilst it might seem that most agree with the measures, because one witnesses most complying, keeping a social distance, that doesn't mean that they all necessarily agree, nor that they don't have some doubts. After all, I'm keeping a social distance from others, or trying to, and I have my doubts about the measures and the necessity of them, but I respect others' rights to think differently. I'm not invading anyone's personal space, because if they have fears of getting the infection, I don't want to upset them, or to provoke their fears worse. I also don't want others to accuse me of endangering them, and to harm my reputation too. I think there will be many, perhaps, who view it like me, who err on the side of caution, not to upset others. It's hard to know why different people are complying, but it could be for many different reasons. For some, they will genuinely feel that being too close to too many others could increase their risk of infection. Yet for others like me, it might be more respecting others' fears of their infection, respecting others' fears of the infection, and wanting to keep a good relationship and a reputation with the public. If generally, I don't generally like to invade others' personal space anyway, or their aura surrounding them, unless I feel they have consented, and I can feel from their body language or the words that they're comfortable, or if I'm in a situation where there appears no choice, like when I'm crammed into a train perhaps, or going through at a festival. But then perhaps that is a choice to use such things. It's hard to estimate how many are genuinely frightened of the infection, yet from my daily visits to the shops and the parks, I've been able to witness a sizable minority who are around others, wearing gloves and masks, but a larger majority who have no gloves or masks yet. They seem to walk past others normally, though the arc walk going around others seems to be quite fairly common. People seem to be quite obliging, especially along the streets, in allowing others a little bit more space, I've noticed. The masks are an interesting indication, but again, we mustn't generalise. Many without masks or gloves may feel that they are still concerned about the risks, and it could be that those mask wearing consider themselves at greater risk due to their job, perhaps as a nurse or home carer, or their physical health, perhaps because of a long-term condition, something like COPD, for example, that might make them more at risk, so more likely to mask up. Certainly, even those without masks and walking fairly normally seem to be much more aware of those about them and the spaces in between them and others. I've noticed much politeness, in fact, less leaning into other people's space around the supermarkets to grab products, less of a goatish behaviour, more patiently waiting for others to move along before occupying that space. The 2 metre rule in the supermarkets is kept strictly in the queue because there are markers on the floor. But since the queue snakes along the supermarket aisles, then a few have to go between those gaps in order to reach and grab the products. A minority seem to enforce the 2 metre rule exactly, virtually all masked. Whilst perhaps due to a limited space and time, many others pass by nearer, but not so close as normal, not touching, but on countless occasions, perhaps within 1 to 2 meters. It's common, yet I've noticed some walking perhaps quicker, perhaps indicating most feel it's okay if you're passing by quick and not stopping to linger nearby others too long. It seems impossible to know what the majority think or feel about a situation, however, with so little information one is able to access. If you consider the vast numbers in population, you're only going to get to read the accounts or talk to and have a conversation with a small, very small representative sample of people. But that's true for any of us, I guess. Although we can learn about other people's actions, we're also not always sure about why they have those actions, what intention or motivation. Why did they avoid close contact with others? Was it because they were afraid of getting infected, or out of respect for other people's fears, or out of fear of being accused of endangering others, perhaps, or of looking different? But I suspect it could be for many different reasons for different people, or even a combination of different reasons. But I don't know the amounts of those, and I shouldn't assume. Only seen one large group so far who dispersed when a police group arrived. No other large groups though, no large gatherings, but again that could be for many different reasons. What are the different beliefs that people might have about social distancing? It could be, and I think there are many people that believe it's absolutely necessary and it must be strictly enforced. And I think there's a large sort of vocal group that believe that. There's also a large group that I think believe it's necessary, but a little bit more lenient about it being enforced, and make exceptions for certain things that they consider essential, depending on the situation. And there's probably a lot of people that actually aren't sure. There's a lot of people that might think it's necessary, but are not sure. So they've got some doubts. But they will, as a precaution, at least abide by the measures, despite those doubts, at least for short term. But I think that's probably where I am at myself. Then there's probably many others that think it's not necessary, but that out of respect for others' beliefs or fears of being scapegoated, they will abide by the measures for however long, depending on the situation. And there may be some that feel it's not necessary, but they perhaps may defy some of the measures sometimes, depending on the situation. There may be those that are uncertain and may defy some measures whilst abiding by some other measures. And surprisingly, it sounds an unlikely group, but there could also be some that are genuinely concerned about the risks of infection and that they believe the measures are necessary, but they will defy them at least sometimes. But that sounds ridiculous. But, you could imagine different scenarios where you confront someone or situation, you witness a situation where someone has perhaps collapsed, or you might witness an assault. It's just as relevant. Do you make contact with them to check whether they're breathing? Do you go up to make sure and see if they're conscious or not? I suppose I think I probably would, personally. I hope I would. Even if you might think, though, it's putting you at risk. There might be a situation. Or if you found a lost child wandering, who was very young, you might want to escort them to the police or relevant authority to reunite them with their family. These might be rare exceptions, perhaps, but there might be other more common ones. If you consider perhaps the role of a nurse or a home carer, some of the actions you might be asked to do could sometimes compromise you or put you in a situation where you may have to consider how close you might have to get to someone and how necessary that is and how well equipped you are for that. How do you keep a social distance whilst helping someone to wash or dress or to take medications or countless other chores? The beliefs of the public may be varied and they may be difficult to assess. They may also be organic. People may change how they feel as the weeks and months go on. They may become more or less concerned of contracting the infection, their feelings about the measures too may change, or may not. Of course, the fact that there will be a spectrum of different beliefs doesn't mean that all beliefs are equally popular or even equally right. Some might be much more popular than others. Social distancing is interesting to observe, and at least it is something that we are able to have some relative control over how close that we feel we can be to others, how far or close we allow ourselves to be to others. So observing this in a variety of different places may give some indication, but one must be wary of not generalising. The shutdowns, on the other hand, were mandated by law rather than just advice, although I think large gatherings have also been mandated as illegal at the moment under the current situation. But businesses that failed to flout the law faced prosecution, so they had to close. It was not that everyone chose to close shop, although some did, but for others it was through force. In fact, in the UK, it was interesting because for a while it was only actually advice to shut down non-essential public places. But many did choose to shut down, actually. Many chose to shut due to the advice that they were given, yet many also stayed open right up until when the ban finally came to legal force. I know because I worked in a restaurant for the week beforehand during that advice. And while some of the numbers of the eaters gradually over the days dwindled, but there were still some at least going out, and I went out to work. And I went out as well to pubs, and went out on the Saturday night to a pub which was full of people. It was just packed full, and people were crammed in quite closely. You know, there was maybe 50 to 100 people. And there were a number of different pubs that were all quite busy within a small area. That being said, town as a whole was much quieter than it normally would have been for Saturday night, and the days preceding that it had gradually been getting quieter anyway, and a large number of businesses had decided to shut down voluntarily, and a large number of people, punters or drinkers, consumers, had chosen not to go out so much. So it was noticeably a lot more quieter, but even so, there was a sizable proportion that went out. The fact that some pubs, restaurants remained open and some were busy indicated to me a fairly sizable proportion did not necessarily believe at that time that they were at significant risk. And I don't know that any new information about the risk of the infection has come to light since that time. So I think that people were probably aware of the dangers then as much as they are now, perhaps, although maybe not. The people in the pub did not seem like nihilists with a death wish, and I don't think that you would want to risk your life for a few pints, a bag of nuts, a chat over the table, and a game of pool. So presumably, all those going out didn't at that point think it was a serious risk. And I'm not aware of any significant new information about the risks of the infection since came to light. That being said, town centre, as I said, was much quieter than normally. Some places voluntarily shut, and many people absolutely felt and still must feel that closer contact with others was and is still a significant risk. So there are a potential spectrum of different beliefs that people might hold, rather than a binary of those for and those against, both self-isolation but also shutdowns. But whether there are a large majority who support the measures or not, we should learn from history, personally and collectively, that majority is not always right. Sometimes they are, but sometimes not. If a large number of people believe something, then it certainly merits us asking, why is that? For what reason have they come to that conclusion? Yes, we should examine whether they are justified in those feelings, looking at the evidence closely, because it's right that we should be concerned what our fellow man says, especially when so many may claim that. But it doesn't mean that we should blindly follow what any majority says. We should not be conformed nor intimidated into believing something that is not the process to find truth. The majority are not always right, even if that's unpopular as an answer. It's factual, though. Just to give one example from history, think of all the racist attitudes or the prejudicial attitudes in some European countries during the height of the colonial era, when many were perhaps ignorant of Africans, had probably never met them or encountered them in their lives. Yet they may have formed very negative views from them, from caricatures of them as primitive, barbaric, and generally inferior. Negative stereotypes like that persisted for some time and even were believed in by many, sadly. Fortunately, many have had experiences with people of different races and found them to be just as human as they are themselves, with just as many flaws and virtues too. Or consider if you grew up perhaps in a family or tribe and they all believed in one religion, while some others grew up with a different family and a different tribe that believed in a different religion. Would your beliefs have been altered simply because the majority around you had changed? If you were moved from one environment to another, would that alter what your beliefs were? Isn't it the moral integrity of that religion that should be examined, but not how popular it is? Most people would probably agree that the majority isn't always right, ironically. Yet wouldn't we all struggle to objectively critique something that was perhaps so ubiquitous, that surrounded us so fully, that encompassed us and surrounded us so much? Wouldn't you find it hard to live as a believer in God in an atheist community, for example, or struggle to live as an atheist even in a religious cult? When speaking out, we might risk losing friends or family, or neighbours might think differently of us, or the public in general. They might disown us, or argue against us, or use vulgarisms to us, or avoid us, or want to re-educate us. They might view us as trying to convert us to the truth, helping to save us, but we may feel that it's oppressive and a kind of indoctrination. These might be extreme cases, but in fact it can happen throughout history in abundance, and you never know when you yourself will be a minority, and indeed it's something that can happen to us all. So popularity, or perceived popularity, is certainly a possible reason why some might not want to question the justification for severe shutdown and self-isolation methods. We might assume if everyone thinks that, it must be true, or feel that perhaps there's safety in numbers. In psychology, countless conformity experiments reveal the human tendency to want to fit in, to be part of something, and not to stand out and be an outsider. We want to feel part of society, not outside of it. The fear of how others might view you is also a possible factor. Due to the nature of the perceived threat, those who don't follow advice and protocol may feel that they risk being accused of putting others at risk. But one should assess this accusation rationally. Is there a real risk, a serious one? One should weigh up the perceived risks against the perceived benefits. Rationally, if I have symptoms of some infectious disease, it would seem common sense to me to avoid visiting others, especially those with serious health conditions, one that might be seriously jeopardized. One might even want to avoid the healthy, perhaps. I've wondered that for some years, in fact. Is it right that some people would go out socializing if they had an infection like the flu and passed it on to others? Isn't that selfish? In fact, I have worked through many viral infections, less serious ones, feeling I needed to financially, or was it the fear of having no money for some weeks, or not wanting to be beaten by the infection and just to carry on? But on one occasion, I did pass on a particularly nasty infection to someone, a colleague. Yes, she did get over it after a few weeks, but I still felt very guilty for giving it to her and having put her at risk. Perhaps I should have taken better precautions, not to have been so close and sneezing and schnoveling in the tissue nearby to others. Rationally, it then makes sense to avoid others when we do have infectious diseases, when there's a genuine reason, but especially to limit and avoid contact with those who are vulnerable. It upset me to see home carers sometimes visiting clients when they would have a cold. It even happened with Mum, when she had COPD and would struggle weeks or months to get over the cold. But we would always forgive them, knowing that they were under such pressures due to the staff shortages at the time, and that they didn't want to be working in that condition anyway. And mistakes happen. Yes, they could have used the equipment and protected the clients better, and I'm sure on some occasions I should have done too, when I worked as a home carer. But does it make any rational sense to avoid others if you don't have any symptoms of an infectious disease? I personally believe it does not, but we each must come to our own verdicts and make that decision for ourselves. In fact, I saw some recent advice, I think it was an online government advice, saying that we should act like we have an infection even without symptoms. But this seems to be a kind of hypochondria, almost acting as if we've got something when we haven't. That sounds the definition of hypochondria. I can see no benefit of a healthy adult avoiding others, especially other healthy adults, and even other people that have some infection. How could you be a risk to other people with an infection if you don't have the symptoms of one yourself? But in the long term, there are potentially a number of possible risks to isolation. In fact, it could lead to a risk of increased mental health problems, of loneliness, depression, addiction. People living with each other could argue more, being cooped up close to each other, could lead to arguments and fighting. But it could equally learn to people getting along and getting to know each other better, having the time to meditate, to pray, to do artistic, creative pursuits, invest time in interests and hobbies, depending on the length of time and the kind of the ability of the person and the effort they put in and the resources they have access to. It could be a very positive, but it could equally be a very negative situation. But it could equally be when people are locked up for long periods of time, like many studies have shown, people can suffer with various mental health problems because we do tend to thrive best when we are social, supporting others, but also being supported.